We are just going to let everybody else in just one more minute, guys. Hello, everyone. If you'd like, feel free to tell us in the chat where you're zooming in from. We like to see where everybody is, where we're convening in from. Right. Here they come. They're pretty well represented. Hi, everyone. Okay, let's get started. Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, Pennsylvania German Enslavers, Initiating a Reexamination. My name is Katie Barnes, and I'm the Director of Genealogical Programs and Services at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. HSP was founded in 1824 and proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History. Our collection contains over 21 million manuscripts that hold stories of all Americans, with particular emphasis on early American history, ethnic and minority groups, science and industry, the arts, and of course, genealogical research. We'd like to extend a special welcome tonight, not only to our subscribing friends of HSP, but to our peers here from the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania as well. And we've got a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, there is closed captioning that is already on. We also will be recording tonight's program, and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email. So if for some reason you don't get to finish it tonight, you can give it a rewatch. And lastly, a quick acknowledgement. Tonight's presentation may be, for some, a sensitive topic. History is not always easy or comfortable, but we're here to learn and explore. At HSP, we believe there are uncomfortable discussions absolutely worth having, so as to work toward a more complete picture of our history in this country, of and for all of its citizens. Jim has a great lecture prepared for us, and at the end, we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. I know that you're going to have some. Go ahead in the meantime and use the Q&A box throughout the program to type in your thoughtful questions as you think of them, though. And please note that we are in webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other, though your questions will have your names attached to them. You're not anonymous. And with that, let's introduce our presenter. Jim Beidler was born, raised, and is currently living again in the Pennsylvania German epicenter of Berks County. Jim is the Executive Director for the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania. Do you want me to wait for you, Jim? You're on mute. All right. Jim is the Interim Executive Director for the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania and the author of 4 commercially published books, including the Family Tree Historical Atlas of Germany. Beidler also writes Roots and Branches, a weekly newspaper column and blog, and is a German Life magazine columnist. So, Jim, whenever you are ready, I will hand this over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Katie. And yes, I want to thank HSP for the opportunity to debut this presentation. It's something that's been on my mind for quite a while, actually. I can trace it back to a bus trip a few years ago from the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center in Kutztown University, where on that bus ride, Patrick Donmoyer, the director of the center, was trying to field questions, and it came up about Pennsylvania Germans and enslavement vis-a-vis those Pennsylvania folks from the British Isles. And I don't know that we got to any conclusions. And tonight, indeed, we're not going to get to any conclusions. This really is initiating a discussion and giving you some starting points to talk about this issue that, well, I know when I was in 4th grade, and I think that's traditional across Pennsylvania, that 4th grade history is Pennsylvania history, or at least a unit on it. my dear fourth grade teacher, Irma Luce, who hasn't passed on very long, because I think she lived to about 105. But slavery was not was either not mentioned or virtually not mentioned. We talked a little bit about indentured servants in Pennsylvania, but slavery was a province of the South. And that's why I think this is all worth a reexamination. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with the context of the first wave of German immigration to America, German-speaking immigration, and these are the folks we call the Pennsylvania Germans. We're going to just, again, kind of review what are some of the unique record groups for researching Pennsylvania Germans, and then transition to talking about what are some of the best record groups for researching the enslaved. And one of the points to make is that there are a fair number of records that do both. And is my screen not being seen? Can you anybody confirm for that for me?
You're not sharing.
Okay, well, let me solve that problem. And I apologize. Oh, I thought I was sharing. Okay. Am I sharing now?
Yes.
Okay, I think.
Well,
now
it's gone again.
It's going again. Okay, I think I know what I'm doing here, and I apologize, folks. I was getting on a good roll there too. But I think I share it. And then I think I was when I was trying to get the PowerPoint into the right mode, I think then I was unsharing it. Okay, now do we have me?
You're good.
Now we have me shared. Okay, apologize for that. It's always technology. So I was talking about context, talking about unique record groups for Pennsylvania Germans, and the fact that there are some record groups for researching the enslaved that are going to be the same records that African Americans are going to be found in, as well as the Pennsylvania Germans. And then a fair part of the lecture will be a case study of the Pennsylvania governor, Joseph Heaster, who was the son of an immigrant. He also happens to be a very, very, very distant cousin of mine. But we have some records relating to him, and really just scraping the surface of records relating to him that have some interesting references to enslavement. And then finally, again, where we kind of end up with first thoughts of how, what, and why the Pennsylvania Germans were enslavers. So that's where we're going now. Sit back and relax, those of you who've done a lot of Pennsylvania German genealogy, because we're just going to give a little bit of a review of the first wave, which was all through colonial times, roughly to about 1800, we say. And we call these people, or historians, I should say, call these people the Pennsylvania Germans. Some will say we really should call them Pennsylvania Dutch. I won't get into the Dutch versus German thing, other than to say, it's not what I learned in grade school. But the main contrast here is we're talking about these first wave Germans, as opposed to the German Americans who come in the 19th century and up until World War I, because they're a completely different breed, usually from different parts of the German states than the Pennsylvania Germans of the colonial times. That's who we're going to be focusing on tonight. And one thing that's always very interesting to me is the fact that there's a huge difference in scale between just about 80,000 German-speaking immigrants who came to America in the first wave versus about 5 million who came in the second wave. And yet, because of the head start that those first waivers had, it's roughly equal numbers of Americans today that are descended from each wave. Because if you think of the genealogy pyramid, you've got some 3 to 5 generations of head start for the first waivers. Okay, a little bit more on the background. When I said about how first wave and second wave differ, one of the things that's very distinctive about the first wave is the great majority of them came from the Palatinate, what's now the Saarland, Baden, Württemberg, and the French, what's now French Alsace, but historically was more German than French. And some were what we call two-steppers, who had come from German-speaking, or some from French-speaking Switzerland too, after the 30 Years' War, and then just a couple of generations later joined this this whole mass migration to first wave migration to America. Most of them left through the Dutch port of Rotterdam. The Rhine River was their superhighway of sorts, their superhighway getting out of Dodge. And many of them, just about all of them really, settled with other Germans in what historians call Greater Pennsylvania, and that extends from upstate New York down through the backcountry of the Carolinas, with the Great Wagon Road being their literal superhighway in colonial times and times afterward. So I'd like to point out that the motivations for emigration are not what is often classically presented. If I heard once, I've heard 1,000 times, oh, well, you know, they couldn't practice their religion in Europe, so they came to America to breathe free. Well, certainly the Anabaptists, that is the Amish and Mennonites, did come to escape religious persecution. But the Lutherans, the Reformed, and the few Catholics that came in the first wave, they were all established churches in Europe. They had no reason to leave, even though it was de jure the case that a German state had to follow the religion of its prince as an established religion. Other religions of the Lutheran, Reformed, and Catholics were usually tolerated, and this again is not something that is generally known. It's not religious freedom they came for by and large, it was economic opportunities. So land, there are a couple of things in the German states. Many of them had partible inheritance rules. If you have rights to 10 acres and you have 5 children, each of them were supposed to get 2 acres. You can quickly see how this goes below the subsistence level. In America, they could buy 100, 200, 300 acres. And often it was the more prosperous farmers that who came. Also, they had to buy their freedom from some type of serfdom. And remember this, because this is something I'm going to bring up later when I do the talk about the riddle of Pennsylvania Germans as enslavers. But what this meant practically is in the German states, in most of the German states, they did not own land in fee simple. They essentially had a long-term, usually inheritable lease to the land. But that's different than here, where you get you take out your warrant, you have it mapped out and surveyed, you get your patent, that's yours. And that was a whole lot different. Most of these folks were some type of farmers. Yeah, there was a smattering of blacksmiths and tanners and so forth, but most of them were pioneer types. As I mentioned, they were the more prosperous peasants who were coming. About a third, and again, pay close attention to the phrasing here. About a third were indentured in some form, but what historians such as Aaron Fogelman, whose hopeful journeys I put in the handout, they often used indenturing as a conscious economic strategy, where, say, you have a family of 6 coming, mother, father, 2 teenagers, a small child, and an elderly parent. The 2 teenagers could be indentured to pay for the passage for all 6. Fogelman estimates that less than 1 in 10 actually served an indenture to a stranger. This is important because most of the folks or many of the folks who served an indenture to a stranger didn't end up reintegrating into Pennsylvania German society, didn't marry, didn't have children. That's why they're not your ancestors. So, okay, finally, many of these folks settled in what I call the Pennsylvania German Arc, which is much of southeastern Pennsylvania, excluding Delaware County, much of Chester County, quite a bit of Montgomery and Bucks, but further up into, and I have the circles as the counties were in colonial times: York County, which included Adams; Dauphin, which included Lebanon; Berks, Northampton, and Lehigh were one county; Lancaster. These were the Pennsylvania German heartlands. Although then in the 19th century, these folks spread out, and there's virtually no pocket of Pennsylvania that doesn't have some Pennsylvania Germans. Maybe not the same concentration, certainly not the same concentration as in, say, Berks County or the Lehigh Valley, where, well, for instance, my dad, who was born in the Tulpehocken area of Berks County in 1928, didn't learn English till he went to school. You know, it was still that concentrated less than a century ago. So let's move on to some of the best and unique records. And again, those of you who've been doing research a long time, I hope you know about these records. But we can always have a good review. The published set called Pennsylvania German Pioneers. They have the oaths of allegiance of the males age 16 and older, and in some cases complete passenger lists starting 1727 going through 1808. And here's an example of one. This is actually an original from the Pennsylvania State Archives, but of the signature pages that are in most editions of Pennsylvania German Pioneers, that they did as facsimile copies, because the original Pennsylvania German Pioneers came out in the 1930s. The technology of the time was so limited that they did tracings to enhance the signatures. Pennsylvania State Archives has the originals, and there are a few when you can see those facsimiles misinterpreted things. And also like to point out in the handout, I not only list the reference to Pennsylvania German Pioneers, but also the fact that it is a database on Ancestry.com, and that sometimes that can be a way, if you have an odd first name you're looking for, to account for the different surname variations that you might not find it in a surname index, that you can do a first name search through that database on Ancestry. That's your hot tip on an old record for tonight. Also, and I should say, when I say unique, these are lists technically of foreigners coming into Pennsylvania in that 1727 to 1808 period. Virtually all of the foreigners at the time were the Germans, because anyone from the British Isles was already a citizen, a subject of the King of Britain, both sides of the water. So those allegiances, they pertain to the Germans. You're not going to find them for those Scots-Irish that everybody is always looking for. Likewise, colonial naturalizations, by and large, are the Germans, because if you were Irish, if you were Scottish, if you were Welsh, if you were English, you all were subjects of the King of England. Actually, you were. If you were from Hanover in Germany, you were also subject, because the Elector of Hanover was also the King of Britain at the time. So those folks didn't have to naturalize. The Germans, they had good reason to naturalize. It made them eligible to vote for the assembly. It made them, probably more important to them, made them eligible to pass on their land, because their land was not technically inheritable if they were still an alien. And in the bibliography in the handout, there are several references to the colonial naturalization. I won't get into details on them tonight, but there were two different eras, and also it's a good example of the fact that a lot of times there is not a record. There are more than one record set. When, like, for in this instance, when we talk about colonial naturalizations, there's an origin set and there's a destination set. In this case, origin that was kept in Pennsylvania, destination that was sent to Britain for rubber stamping by Parliament. And I know it will shock you to find out that those are not carbon copies of each other, because this was way before carbon copies. So that's another thing to realize. Church registers. I have several lectures on church registers. All I'm going to say here is that they are, well, as my late mentor John Humphrey said, they are the heart and soul of German genealogy, because they are our vital records before there are state-kept vital records. And the only point I want to make here is, while we think, I think all of us are familiar with baptisms, marriages, and burials as being record sets that we go to in church registers. Don't forget, there are also things like communion lists, and this communion list here that is in HSP's collections that have been digitized. I think they're on both Ancestry and Find My Past, and were some of the original GSP collections that were microfilmed and then digitized. Here are communion records. It's only a narrow window in the 1750s to early 1760s from St. Michael's and Zion Lutheran in Philly. But it gives rich information, including if you see in the top middle, wie lange im Land, how long in the land. This is telling you how many years since these people landed, presumably in Philadelphia, as nearly all of them did. So this is kind of an oddball record that you might not think of communion lists or confirmation lists or treasury notes or things like that. There are times they still exist. And then finally, another record that there are many more for Pennsylvania Germans than some other ethnicities, and these are Bible registers, family registers, and Taufscheine. Taufscheine is the plural of baptismal certificates, simply. And these fill in the gaps of those aforementioned church registers, because we were the frontier at this time. Congregations were just forming. There was a huge shortage of clergy, and so many of these congregations didn't have a pastor. Or one who was just passing through. And so records were catch as catch can. And a lot of these private certificates are the ones that we need to use to find the baptisms, or Trauscheine that are marriage certificates. And this particular one is just one of my well, Reverend Daniel Schumacher is my favorite Frocktor artist. Indeed, he was kind of the originator of Frocktor folk art. And this is from the collection of my friend Dr. Robert Klein in Newmanstown, Lebanon County, of a Johannes Sontag, or John Sunday, as we would call him today. I show off this is a photocopy. Obviously, this is one I would give my eye teeth to have. It's another Schumacher. It's of a direct line ancestor of mine, but I don't know where it's at. I got the photocopy from the late Coronavirus some years ago, and by the time I got around to looking at the antiques dealer who had it one time, he no longer had it. One that is in my collection is a later piece from, this is of a Harrison Heister. It's actually a grandson of that previous man, Johannes Kramer. And this Harrison Heister piece was penned and colored by Francis Lavon, who was a mid-19th century Frocktor artist. There are also other records that I would term not unique, but very, very helpful. And these are the many tax lists and probate files, land records, including both the original land records of first purchases, either from the pens during the proprietary era or from the Commonwealth after the Revolution. And then finally, the Centennial census, Pennsylvania's once every 7-year census that began in 1779, ended in 1863. Only about 11% of the returns remain, but those that do are somewhat informative. And we'll start when we talk about transition to records of African Americans. Let's start with the ones they had in common with the slaveholders. Tax lists, and I should point out there are loads of different tax lists on the state level, on the county level. Just like I was saying earlier, as far as naturalizations don't stop with just one iteration of it. There may be a second one. Well, there may be as many as 3 different types of taxes going on at the same time. Now this one only identifies numbers, as they use the dated term Negroes for those who are enslaved. A lot of these are in the published Pennsylvania archives. There's also a database on Ancestry. That's a good database of the state ones that's in the handout. And then there are many, it depends on the particular county, how many are extant, but a lot of them, and some of them do get into more details. Then the probate files, and we're gonna look at this, Will, when we get to the Heister family in more detail. But sometimes the names of the enslaved, or at least the references to their being enslaved as part of the estate, are going to be in the wills and other estate papers. And not in the will, and one of these other estate papers that they might be listed is inventories. And here's one from my friend Michael Emery that he recently got at a sale of an estate of a man named Peter Hunter. And here in the inventory is the grim sort of math, where right above the livestock listed in the property is one Negro wench worth 50 Pennsylvania pounds, which we find it odd today. We might think that American dollars were the only currency starting with the Revolution, but the Pennsylvania pound was in use well into the first quarter of the 19th century. Centennial census. This is very interesting, especially the 1800 Centennial census. Well, each one from the gradual emancipation, beginning with the gradual emancipation law in 1780, each one of the Centennial censuses was supposed to include a list of the registered enslaved. And here's the one from the 1800 Centennial census of Lancaster County. And it does have the room for names of the enslaved, although in most cases we just have gender and ages of them and the list of the name of the slave holder. But you do have some potential for names here. Then moving on to records unique to African Americans, still will name some of the enslavers, but first one is the 1780 registers of the enslaved. As I referenced, 1780 Pennsylvania passed a law for gradual abolition, and it was fairly gradual because those who were registered right away in 1780 could still be bound for life. And those who were born to enslaved people could be enslaved for 28 years. And there was a way to register them after the fact. Great database. And I should say, yes, too, these are supplemented by continuing registers on the county level. In your handout are the references and the URL for this database of some 6,300 of the enslaved from beginning with this 1780 Act and then continuing on with the county registers and with those who were bound for the 28-year terms. So this is a very, very valuable database, not complete, and we have represented in that, as far as I can tell, these counties, the names of the counties at the time, and this is 1780 that I'm talking, are outlined in red, and they're rough boundaries of what they included. The only one that we don't appear to have any records from is Northumberland, which was at that time the biggest chunk of north central Pennsylvania. And what we also know is that perhaps not all of these have surfaced, because Lehigh professor Scott Gordon was prowling around in HSP just a few months ago. Big hat tip to him, because he found the 1780 register of the enslaved for Northampton County. And this had been basically lost to history. There is cited in the Just and True Return database I believe it's 1860 book that did list some excerpts from this list, but did not name the enslaved. But these original registers do at least give first names to those enslaved. Manumission papers. Not a huge number of manumission papers exist, and you can. Well, I'd prefer you not drawing conclusions from the fact that not many exist, because we just don't know. The ones that have are found in county recorder of deeds offices. And just like deeds for land, there are many land transactions that went unrecorded, because you had to pay a fee to record those land transactions. And I know many of my Pennsylvania German ancestors were far too frugal to do that. And this one actually is one of my direct line ancestors whose executors manumitted to enslaved people in the very early 1800s after he died in the 1790s. Business ledgers and registers may mention the enslaved. And then finally, newspaper advertisements of sales and seeking runaways. And here's one again. I turned to my friend Michael Emery, and I think this was just wrapping other papers. Was a fragment of a newspaper from Franklin County in the 1790s, but it is advertising a sale. So you have many of these. Some of them just list gender, maybe ages. The runaway ads, of course, were very specific because they were trying to get this person back. And it's interesting to me the contrast that these early 1800s newspaper advertisements will give physical descriptions of African Americans who were runaways at a time when we probably have, for most poor whites, have no physical description of them at all. Interesting contrast. So crux of a lot of this presentation is the fact that it's all over the map in the limited amount of literature on the subject. A quote from an article, and I believe this was in the 1980s, saying that the Germans generally held no slaves. Then in a conversation I was having with someone recently, they said that they're wondering why more of the Pennsylvania Germans were enslavers versus other white ethnic groups. So which one of these things is not like the other? So let's turn to Joseph Heaster. And I'll say, I went with him because of familiarity and already knowing his life's outline better than I would have some other people. Truthfully, as time goes on, there are others I want to investigate in my ancestry. But because really, when we're, as genealogists, if we're doing our job with the fan club, friends, associates, and neighbors, well, we ought to be thinking about any enslaved people in the household, because they were closer than the neighbors, and we ought to be thinking about that. But yeah, Joseph Heaster had a long political career. He was the son of an immigrant, and he climaxed that career as governor of Pennsylvania. And as we'll see through a number of evidence, and I'm not even showing every piece of evidence here, he definitely held a number of enslaved people. Here's the basic family tree. He was the son of the eldest of three brothers, and yes, this is a three brothers story that's actually true. They came from Elzhoff in Wittgenstein, which is now part of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. And another story to tell is how for years and years, a Heaster genealogist in the early 20th century went over to Germany, and because he didn't know German as well as he thought, he managed to combine two families, and he had the mother's maiden name wrong. Oh my, and that has survived as an error in print in new articles for close to a century. But yeah, Joseph, and then his uncle and cousin. His uncle, he was born Johann Daniel. Most of them were baptized with a prefix name. He went by Daniel, and his son William. Daniel started out in Montgomery County, or what was then Philadelphia County, and his house on the Sumneytown Pike is brick house, because he was a tanner and a brickmaker. Still exists, has been restored lovingly by Lisa Minardi, and then he moved to Berks County and built another brick house. And when he died in 1790s, he lived in Reading. And his will gives you an outtake, talking about all my Negroes. And, it talks about the distribution. And also gives a line about an enslaved person named Leonard Koff, who, of course, there's no social security plan for anybody in these days, but he decrees that his son shall maintain him into, up to death, even after he no longer can labor. And that's an interesting notation, especially to me, because this Daniel Heaster Sr. doesn't have the best reputation in the family from what I've heard. And my direct line ancestor is this Johannes Heaster, and of course they all named them for uncles. So he was named for the governor's father. And this Johannes, he, as far as I can tell, did not have any enslaved people. He's the only line where there's no politician in it. I have three consecutive in geography land drafts to show you. This one from HSP, that's from the collection of Daniel Heaster Jr., obviously this, well, shouldn't say obviously because they're not always father and son when they're senior and junior at that time. But this is his land draft. If you see that big seam in the middle, that's the Plum Creek. And indeed, the Heaster cousins were lords of the Plum Creek Valley at this time, because we've got, this is Daniel Sr.'s land, then William's land. I think William made the draft for Daniel Jr. to show him all the properties. Then this is my ancestor Johannes or John Heaster, and again you see the Plum Creek coming down the middle here. And at the bottom, if you see Joseph Heaster Esquire, well then that moves on to this piece here, and that's the governor and his 724 acres. That was his country place. He also, when he died, he had about 15 plots in Reading. He was in addition to being a politician, was also in Reading. So these three cousins had some 2,000 acres in Bern Township, Berks County, and the interesting thing is, just a very few enslaved people, none from Johannes, a few held by Daniel. And the ones held by Joseph, the governor, they are always enumerated in Reading and not in Bern Township. I'm not sure if that's significant or not. As I'm saying, a lot of this is still a beginning of a conversation. In that just and true return database, he had two, a man and a woman who he had enslaved, who he registered right away when the law went into effect in 1780. And then in the early 1800s, he registers people as 28-year slaves. These were people who were born of a slave mother, and I believe they had to be registered within a certain amount of time after birth to be held in this limited time bondage. And then some of the records relating to him. There's a 1787 tax list. And here he has two Negroes worth 150 or valued at 150 Pennsylvania pounds. 1790 census, they're still listing two enslaved people. 1800 Pennsylvania Centennial census showed you the Lancaster County one earlier, the register of the enslaved. Here's the Berks County one, and Joseph's enslaved person Dinah, who was listed in the 1780 register. She is still in 1800 here. 1820, the last census he's alive for, or that he's found in, no enslaved persons. Now, none of his probate petitions regarding his estate nor his inventory mention enslaved people, nor are there manumission petitions for any of them. So at some point, these folks were free, whether by his action, by runaway. These are all questions still to be addressed. I kind of feel I really just tipped my put my little toe in the water to this, but I think it's encouraging a good discussion because, as I said before, these are folks who were in the households in one way or another. So now let's talk about the uses of enslaved people by the Pennsylvania Germans, and actually by all ethnic groups in Pennsylvania. So first, many of them were used in forges and furnaces. Here we go to Lebanon County for the Cornwall Furnace Museum. And again, I say this in a very, very tentative way, that you have a lot of, in terms of numbers of the enslaved, the industrial factories of the time, there seem to be, more larger numbers than I see as domestic servants. There you may see one, maybe two in a household, such as they call it now Plum Creek Place. This is the other house that was built by Daniel Heaster Sr.'s son William Heaster. I believe some of it may date to Daniel, but there were some enslaved people here, and likely used as domestic servants. And then finally, agriculture. And here I'm most tentative of all. Our farmers in Pennsylvania and our farming, there were some intensive times, like when it was time to gather the wheat, where it was all hands on deck. But my impression is that we did not have the same type of plantation style use of the enslaved, because we didn't have those type of crops with needing continual picking. It was more things that at certain times of the year, everybody together. And as I speculate here, what was the order of labor here? We know a lot of them had an awful lot of kids, and I'm sure they were used on these farms. But these are more questions to speculate about. And then finally, and I just wanted to note the Peter Vence farmstead in Montgomery County is another example of agricultural labor of the enslaved. So now we have what I call the riddle of Pennsylvania Germans as enslavers, and here I'm just asking questions, and hopefully will spur good thoughts in all of you in the audience. And I know they are spurring an awful lot of work that I need to do as I dip my second toe in the water and eventually dive on in. And this riddle, to me, as I reflected on earlier, these people were essentially serfs in Europe. In many cases, they no longer had to give service to their lord or prince. They had to pay taxes, sometimes onerous taxes, and they had to pay an exit tax to leave. But what is it with these people who experienced that some of them then became enslavers themselves? And I could be, after I studied this a long time, that I may come to the conclusion that I'm overthinking it, and that it's just a case of following the money. But before I do that, I want to give some consideration. is there just a lack of political consciousness? Is what I'm looking at as a conundrum, is it more simple that, well, sure, there are classes, and now we're further up the hierarchy, and yeah, now we will do even worse than what was done to us. Another thing that I may think I know an answer to about differences between the Anabaptists versus the church Germans, the Lutheran and Reformed, who were about 5/6 of the total of the Pennsylvania Germans in colonial times. And some of the limited literature does indicate that the Lutheran and Reformed were not overly embracing of abolition. I'd like to investigate that further. And then finally, to really do some granular research to see about, are there contrasts between the immigrants from the more authoritarian German states versus the Swiss cantons that, while not true republics, were more of oligarchies rather than sole ruled states, because there were direct immigrants from German-speaking Switzerland, not just those two-steppers that I referenced earlier. That's what I have. I remarked to Katie and Justina Barrett that normally when I'm doing a presentation, I have taken that full dive into the water and feel like I'm presenting some conclusions and hypotheses. Whereas this, I feel like I barely have scratched the surface and that I am only opening the conversation. But I think there's definitely some merit to that, and I hope you all agree. And I now see Katie has come on screen and is very likely going to be feeding me some of your questions from the Q&A box.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that. We've got a few questions already. So we'll start with the ones that we have, and if anyone else wants to add them, please stick them in the Q&A box rather than the chat. Michael asks, how many Americans are descended from both waves? I am one grandparent on each side.
Yeah, and of course the difficulty in this answer is how people self-identify. A lot of times they either don't know about their maternal ancestry or like their maternal ancestry on their paternal side, and there may be a lot of hidden Germans in that part of the pedigree. But the best estimate is about 80 million people in America have a German ancestor, and so about 40 million from the first wave, about 40 million descendants from the second wave.
Okay. Wesley asks, why did most Deutsch immigrants enter through Philly when most weren't concerned about religious freedom but economics? Why not more through New York?
Well, the answer to this is fairly simple, because Philadelphia was the largest port in colonial times. I mean, New York was substantial, but Philadelphia was where it was at. And very soon after its founding in the 1680s, became the hub of British North America, and that was not just for the Germans, but also for the Scots-Irish, because the Cumberland County is the epicenter for the Scots-Irish in America. So yeah, they were coming to Philadelphia, and our nickname, the Keystone State, because there's colonies to the north, colonies to the south, Jersey to the east. Well, that also applies. You could go anywhere from Philadelphia.
Okay. Diane says, since they were private records, can you give any insight into what is the best way to try to locate Taufscheine?
Oh, very excellent question. Oh, yeah. I mean, thankfully, there's been a real boom, and of course, I gotta watch dating myself here. It's for like the last 20 years, there's been a huge publication boom in books. Just about every Southeast Pennsylvania historical society has published a volume on its collected Proctor. And so there's unfortunately no comprehensive private index to all the private collections, but these works, Lisa Minardi has done a book, one a private collection, large private collection. The late Corinne Ernest, she did a number of books that explored these. So it's really just looking. A lot of times the key is getting one Proctor in a family, because if a particular artist was favored for one, they probably did Taufscheine for the whole family. And the works of Corinne Ernest, she has done a 4-volume set of basically all the Proctor artists and scriveners that are known to have been working in Pennsylvania.
Simple question from Maureen. How many people were enslaved in Pennsylvania in 1780?
Simple, you say? Well, and the only estimate I'm going to come up with is from that database, where there are about 6,300. Now, some of those are from later than 1780. So that's one I would have to get back to you on with a more precise figure.
Let's see, Justina, are you typing an answer to Bonnie? While I wait for that, I will move on to the next one. Edith says, where does the 1688 Germantown petition in favor of abolishing slavery fit in your research? A German, Pastorius, was among those who drafted it, even though the Quakers did not have the courage to adopt it for the colony.
Yeah. Where that fits in is basically the earliest point of the timeline and it comes into a bit of Sturm und Drang of back and forth of, yes, you have this petition, and yes, those pious Quakers indeed didn't want to touch it. But interestingly enough, the Pastorius people, they were basically a form of Anabaptists. People also call them Dutch Quakers. They again were not the mainstream of the Germans coming to Pennsylvania. So unfortunately, they're more an aberration than what I expect to find in the mainstream Lutheran and Reformed.
Backtrack to Bonnie's question. Did the churches make any comments or provide any guidance on the issue of parishioners holding enslaved people?
This is the type of question that I'm probably going to give this same answer a couple of times, and that this is fodder for future research, because I don't know. And now, because that's gonna there's going to be a lot of silence, I have a feeling, but I want to ferret that out and see, like I'm saying, anything Lutheran, Reformed. What did these groups, did they have any sort of policies?
Okay. Richard says, how much of this discussion carries over to the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, part of, quote, Greater Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, good to see you, Richard, by the way. Well, all of it carries over, and plus the added thing that, of course, enslavement stayed legal until after the Civil War in Virginia. So whereas you have the gradual abolition starting in 1780 in Pennsylvania, you have it continue to be enthusiastically endorsed in Virginia, including the Shenandoah Valley, and there you have some more tendency toward a plantation economy.
We'll just do a couple more. Nancy asks,
I'm not going anywhere.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Do we know where the slaves came from, the South or where?
Oh, I do not. I expect that they probably came directly into Port of Philadelphia because there's no prohibition against. Well, I don't know about the state level. There's no federal prohibition until 1808. So, yep, I'm gonna have to put that in my future research category to ferret that one out, Nancy. But I suspect they were direct importation because the South was not super well developed at this point.
Okay, real quick, it is 7:30 just after, so anyone that needs to go, we want to thank you for coming and spreading the word that HSP is doing about American records and the educational efforts that we're trying to take. And a particular thanks again to our HSP members. Your support is critical in this endeavor. So anyone else who wants to stick around and continue listening to Jim answer questions, we will continue with the questions, but I wanted to give the thanks and turn the rest of you loose if you have somewhere else to be.
And to those being turned loose, my email is there. Please, if we don't get to your question now, feel free to email me.
Sounds good. Jesse asks, I wonder if the specific topic has ever been brought up when taking oral histories.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, the kind of the great age of the oral histories in the WPA project would have been the 1930s. There was obviously some enslaved people from, say, the born 1830s, 1840s, a few of them. I would speculate very few of them were enslaved people from Pennsylvania. Could they have been a child or a grandchild? Possibly. But I mean, that's a good one to investigate.
Michael's question, I think we kind of answered this one already. How many Pennsylvania Germans owned slaves?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, we've just given a very, very tentative answer because that's something that we need to mix all these records together and really look at the data to come up with hard percentages. But so far, I'm seeing that industry was where most of the enslaved were used.
Catherine asks, do you know anything about the slaves owned by John Bishop of Exeter? I know his first wife was tried and acquitted of beating her slave girl to death.
Ooh, send that to me. Send that one to me, and I want to look at my files on that. So.
The handout has been posted in the chat a couple times. If you want to scroll up in the chat, you'll find that as a PDF there, if that helps. Julie says, is there a database or documentation of slave trade and transactions in Philadelphia, Berks County, or Pennsylvania?
Slave trade and transactions. I don't know as far as the trade. As I referenced earlier, some transactions would show up in the newspapers. So that's a source there. Likely also in the newspapers is where we might find some references to importation of the enslaved.
Okay. Thomas says, do you ever find mention of the enslaved having a desirable skill, perhaps at a furnace or a musician for the local community? I have heard of Peter Yoder's slave Anthony being the best fiddler in the Ole Valley.
Oh, I haven't done that type of granular research, but you've got me very curious. Because like when I referenced in Daniel Heaster's will, that Leonard Koff, I doubt that it was just completely the kindness of Daniel's heart that he was mentioning him. He was at least some type of loyal retainer, if not having some sort of special skill like you're referencing, Thomas.
Pamela says, I recently learned a new term to replace runaway slave. Have you heard the term self-emancipated people?
Self-emancipated people. I have not. And I will freely admit that Sometimes the new turns on language, yeah, I've got to beat them into my head because I've heard the old ones so long. But that's one in every case. These turns of language need to be carefully evaluated. I agree.
She goes on to say, I am African American from ancestors who arrived in the early 18th century. Although I haven't traced any ancestors to Pennsylvania, I am interested in the subject after learning that my DNA registers as 10% German, which was a surprise to me. When you found the listing for mulatto enslaved workers, meaning biracial, do we know who their fathers might have been?
Oh, well, we certainly can speculate. And in the first instance, it's going to be speculation, but it's something valid to think about, because in the case of Joseph Heaster's enslaved people, the two individuals who he registered as 28-year to be bound for 28 years. My presumption is that they were born in the early 1800s, probably to this woman Dina, who was enslaved in Reading to Joseph, who was the father. I would love to carry the research further of those children to see if I can trace them forward and trace descendants, and do up some DNA. Yeah.
Julie says, looking for specific information regarding Captain George Kemp of Maxitawny Township and an enslaved woman, Hannah. It might be one you want to email Jim.
Send me an email. Absolutely. Yep.
And then, hi, Scott Gordon. Has anybody counted or estimated what percentage of the enslaved men and women included in Corey Young's database from the registers of the enslaved were enslaved by Pennsylvania Germans rather than the English descended groups?
And I know I have not. Scott, and that's exactly the sort of granular type of stuff that we need to start doing. And thanks again for your great find at HSP.
Wesley asks again, did Deutsch immigrants purchase their slaves directly in Pennsylvania or through southern colonies where there were many more slaves available for purchase?
I am just absolutely ignorant of how well developed the slave trade in between the colonies was developed at that point. I'm a little skeptical of whether it was, but it's one that bears research.
And we just have a nice little shout out. Hi, James. It's your cousin Desiree Heaster. Thank you for the amazing lecture and history of our Heaster relatives.
Thanks for tuning in, Desiree.
Got some thanks. Tim asks, were there any compensatory provisions of the Gradual Abolition Act?
Oh, that's another good question. I don't believe so, but because I definitely do not know. But I'm going to guess there were not, because when that was enacted, it was by a very radical one-house Pennsylvania legislature. If you look in the records of the time, they are captioned at the top "Res Publica Pennsylvania," Latin for the Republic. And so it was a very radical constitution that only lasted until 1790, when it was replaced by another state constitution.
Oh, I think we're getting close with the end. Olivia asks, do you hear of any African Americans living in Lancaster in 1830s live on Welsh Mountain? Would they have been free people of color?
That's another good one. And please hit me up by email on that, Olivia, because I want to take some of these more granular ones and do the further research when I'm not under the gun like I am right now. So
I think we reached the end of the questions so far. There's a lot of very kind comments thanking you.
Yes, don't omit Purnell Stout here. I met him at a Lancaster Mennonite conference a few years ago. Good to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in.
And there's more in the chat. So
great.
Make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay. Well, Thank you all again for coming. You have Jim's email address there, and the handout is in the chat and as a PDF. And you can reach out to us if you have any questions. As I said at the beginning, this is recorded and it will be sent out to you in a follow-up email, so you can rewatch if you'd like. Thank you all and have a good evening.